سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. The topic, as you heard, the topic of my talk today is his character was the Quran. Today we are all here to honor the memory of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But besides praising him, I think it's also important when we honor him to take some time to think about the Prophet and exactly what does this mean and what his example means. So what I'm going to do today is I talk about the hadith transmitted by his wife Aisha. His character was the Quran, kana khuluquhu al-Quran. I'm going to also talk about some other points and introduce some concepts for us to think about. The first concept I want us to think about, inshallah, is the concept of what is the essence of what the Prophet meant. What, in a sense, is the essence of the Sunnah. And I'm going to talk about that as how this concept is reflected, or this idea is reflected in a famous book of veneration of the Prophet. And also I'm going to talk about two terms that come from fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, that most of us know. The first term is asl, which in Arabic means root, or principle, or fundamental, or foundation. The second term is far', which means literally branch, but is also taken to be anything that's derivative of the root, or anything that comes from the root, that stems from the root. Secondary concepts, secondary issues. I'm going to talk specifically about a very famous book of veneration of the Prophet, on the Prophet. This is a book written by Qadi Iyad. I'll speak about him a little later. It's called Shifa bi Tarif Huquq al-Mustafa, a very famous work on, it's called The Antidote, through knowledge of the rights of the chosen Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in this book, among other things, Qadi Iyad talks about what is the asl of what we could call the prophetic personality, or the Muhammadan personality. What is central? What made the Prophet exactly what he was, for us to understand him? And I'm talking about this today because getting to the root of things, as Dr. Mirza mentioned, is, if anything, one of the most fundamental parts of tasawwuf. People who have an inclination to tasawwuf, whose hearts are inclined to tasawwuf, are generally not people who are satisfied just with the surface of things. Those who are interested in tasawwuf want a little bit more. They want to find out a little bit more. They want to probe a bit more deeply. And so they want to go to the root. And one finds this interest in the root of things in tasawwuf throughout the entire history of the tradition. For example, my wife right now is just finishing a translation that she's doing of one of the earliest works on Sufi women. It's a work by Abdurrahman Sulami that was written shortly before his death at the beginning of the 11th century Miladi. And the manuscript itself comes from the same century. And in this book, there's mention of the sisters of the famous Sufi Bishr al-Hafi. His sisters were called Zubda, Mudra, and Mukha. Now, these are probably nicknames, but again, we have to think of what they mean. In Arabic, Zubda means essence. Mudra is a chewed lump of flesh, refers to the passage in the Quran about the beginning of the human being. It means fetus or embryo. And Mukha, depending on what dialect of Arabic one's using, can mean anything from brain to marrow of a bone, the inside of a bone. And again, these three names of the three sisters of Bishr al-Hafi are important because they reflect this point of getting to the essence of things, getting to the root of things. Again, the sisters were called essence, embryo, and marrow. So I hope today, inshallah, in my talk, I'll be able to, through the teachings of Qadi Iyad, this famous scholar from the Muslim West, to give a little bit of a sense of what was the essence, the marrow of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For most people today, especially in the modern world, where young people are faced with choices between tradition and modernity, between finding ways of dealing with a culture that is non-Muslim, often alien, that has values that they don't share, and yet has some values that they do share, the question of what is to be done of the Sunnah, what is essential of the Sunnah, what example of the Prophet do we have to hold on to and to follow at any cost, and what examples are matters of, say, taqwa, that are things done for individual purposes or fear of God. This is particularly important. So in today's world in the United States, I tend to see the importance of the Sunnah as focusing above all on our moral responsibility. Now, let's take a look, to begin with the famous hadith that forms the basis of my talk. As I said, it's a hadith transmitted by the Prophet's wife Aisha. When asked, what was the Prophet like? Closer. What was the Prophet like? She said, Kana khuluquhu al-Qur'an. But that's not all. Not only his nature was the Qur'an, or his character was the Qur'an. She said, Kana khuluquhu al-Qur'an yarda bi ridahu wa yaskhatu bi sakhtihi. Meaning his nature was the Qur'an. He was pleased, or he approved of what the Qur'an approved of, and displeased with or hated what the Qur'an hated or disliked. Now this is important, the second half of this hadith, which is very often not remembered by people, because it tells us that the first asl we have to think about, the first root in thinking about what is the prophetic personality, what is, if I can use the term, the Muhammadan personality, the first root is the word of Allah itself, Quran. This hadith does not mean that the Prophet and his sayings have the same value as the word of Allah. It means that everything that the Prophet did was in accordance with the word of Allah. The word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reverberated within him, and that reverberation came out in his actions, which we know of as the Sunnah. And indeed the Quran stresses this aspect of the primacy of following the word of Allah himself over and over again. The moral responsibility of the Muslim is epitomized in the Quran by a covenant that was struck between Allah and the human being even before the creation of mankind. This is the famous verse in the Quran, we offered the entrustment